Hi everyone.
Hey, Jack.
Hey, Jack.
Hello everybody. Okay, looks like we have a quorum here, so we can get started. Thanks everyone for joining today's Catholic Sync. First of all, apologize that I did not record the meeting last time. I thought I said auto record, but seems like it was not working, but I think this time it is working. So we should be able to get recordings automatically starting from this meeting. Before we start with the discussions, any comments? Okay, so let's get into the topics to discuss. The first one is partial metadata loading. I think there's a tab-less discussion. Anyone would like to discuss?
Is Hydro or Eric seeing the call? I think this is Hydro and Eric's proposal.
Yeah, looks like he's not here yet. Maybe we can jump to the next one first.
I can give a brief
Okay.
discuss. Yeah, summary. We did this once. I think this is bring up in last thing as well for the partial managed loading. So the main purpose for this new API is there's a lot of requirements for partial loading the table response, load table response. Some of the use case like Impala from the Impala team, they only need to understand if the table has been updated, which means the metadata file path will be good enough. They don't have to load the whole things. The other concern is about if you have like the 3,000 the snapshots in your metadata JSON file, then it becomes a very large to load them. Or if you have a super wide table with a bunch of the schema history, then it's going to becomes larger and larger, and it become problems every time you have to load the whole thing. So I think everyone already have the proposal to separate slicing one piece, which is credential out of this load table response to specific endpoints. This proposal itself is focusing, instead of we trying to meet all this requirement by creating new endpoints, we allowed client side to send back the requirements. For example, I only need a certain piece of the information, which, for example, the schema only, or snapshot only, or the metadata JSON path only. Then the client side can send it back to the then the server can send it back to the clients for that particular information. This is just a gist of what the proposal is. Last time, I think we have a discussion with Ryan, Daniel Weeks for this one. One of the major concerns, I think, first, what Ryan mentioned is it could be a bulk operation. Means, for example, one of the if you have UI try to grab a bunch of table or just display the schema, you can be squeeze them together. I think the question itself still then to, even for that use case, we still need to slicing one particular information from the whole metadata JSON file. So I think I'm okay with to binding multiple together. And another concern is the other slicing. For example, if you a client wanna load a table and access the table, for particular snapshots, then it need a bundle of the metadata information, not only just one piece of them. So should we put this responsibility from client side to let client decide what kind of information it needed to load that particular table or access that particular table? Or we just give a bundle of information, say, oh, okay, this is snapshot you want to load, this is snapshot ID you want to load, and the server will decide a bunch of the information, like table property schema, and of course the snapshot information then back to the client side. So I think that's also a solvable things. We can provide some kind of a bundle instead of the client have to customize all the information by themselves. Which I think we don't want our clients to take that burden. That's 2 points I think to consider from the last discussion. I think first this Monday actually we have another sync. So I think overall people agree on this use case. There's a lot of use case want to just a slice of level table response instead of instead of the whole of them. There there's another concern about, so how do are we going to create a new API, or we consider as load table v2? To be honest, I'm okay with a new API, but I think create load table v2 is also a reasonable move for us. And that's a brief. Yeah, that's the history of this discussion.
I guess so. How do we want to move forward with this? Seems like there. Uh,
I think we need to have a little bit more discussion about this because I definitely think that there are problems with using that approach with the V1 load path because the way that we have everything defined, a lot of the fields are required. And we would actually have to update the table load response to make everything optional at that point. And now we're not actually reflecting from table metadata or anything else, like what is actually required for a table. We're kind of piecing and parting that out to satisfy a client's like, oh, I just want to load the specific information. It's also going to be really difficult to manage from the implementation standpoint because you don't have all the fields that you need in order to process metadata. So I think that there are real challenges with trying to adapt that to the V1 load path. And then the question is it really worth having two load paths, one where everything is optional and one where everything is specific based on the requirements of table metadata? So I don't think we're ready to move forward. I think we need to have more discussions about what that looks like. And if we can address this in either skinnying down metadata through better maintenance or a couple additional endpoints to satisfy these specific needs, not redesigning the entire load table path. So I'm not convinced that either approach that we're talking about is the right answer yet.
I think for the question of if we want to if we give client side too much burdens, or if how do we meet the requirements for the V1 use case currently existing? One of the answer is if you don't do anything, like client does not send back any parameters for this new thing, then it just use the default behavior from the V1 endpoint. I think that could be good enough.
I'm not sure that we can specify it that way though, right? You know, when you define in the spec what's required for the response, you can't have one option where it's like, oh, I'm not going to pass back required fields. So it either has to be a completely new load response where everything's optional. This is where I'm having problems with it. I don't think that, like, I understand the use case. I think we're trying to provide a lot of flexibility by trying to say, hey, basically everything's optional and the client can just define what pieces it wants. But that really complicates things from the specification perspective. And I'm not sure that, like, the implementations that we have out there right now can really take advantage of that either currently.
I think it's just meant for
does it mean that we may have some kind of two different specs? Is what you mean then?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. What did you say, JB?
Yeah, I mean that what you're saying seems like we will need some kind of two different spec just to V1 and V2, which is not exactly the proposal here.
Yeah, it would actually force that, like, so if we wanted to do the client being able to declare which things get returned, you would need both a V1 and a V2, but the only real effective difference between them is V2, everything is just optional in the response.
Yeah, I think that's, I think what Daniel said makes sense, because right now in V1, we actually require the metadata, the whole metadata, which if we want to keep that compatibility, backward compatibility in V2, then it's really harder to like just remove that as optional because it's requiring the V1, then some kind of a protocol breaking between the client side and the server side. But another option we proposed here is to have a complete independent API, not considered as a V2. I think I'm okay with that solution as well.
I'm more in favor of, I mean, not sure it would be a good idea to have a V2 just changing the way we load table and stuff like that. I think you favor that it would be easier to add a dedicated endpoint that behave differently to the regular one we have currently. That's maybe easier to clearly identify without introducing a too much breaking change. But it means that we need to include this change on the client side. Implementation, I mean.
Yeah, we have to do the client side change anyway, right?
Yeah, but I mean that we don't introduce a new spec. It's still the same spec with a new endpoint.
Yeah, I think the Daniel's the compatibility concern is valid. So we may just pursue a new endpoint, that agreement.
Well, what do you mean by pursuing a new endpoint? So like I'm actually not advocating for a new endpoint. What I'm saying is I think we should look at the specific use cases and see if is that something that we should introduce like a specific endpoint for like, hey, load this specific snapshot, or load the table property, or get last update timestamp, whatever it is. Specific endpoints underneath the existing table path that just represent those specific requests, as opposed to trying to make an endpoint that's a generic endpoint that can grab you any arbitrary information from metadata.
And what about keeping the endpoint and just adding a header param, which is basically just to control the way we return the table metadata?
So that gets into the problem of the table metadata has specific requirements about what is required and what is optional. So I don't think that you can do that and still have a valid spec for what is table metadata.
Okay, got it.
So my main question here, because like I don't understand the real pushback against the generic endpoint here, because in my mind we have a JSON object that we've defined that is metadata.json. We know how to get fields out of it. So why would we want to add a new endpoint every time we add something new to that metadata.json that might want to get pulled separately? And I see it not just from the clients we have that are reading Iceberg tables, but the clients that are interacting with Iceberg tables in ways that aren't reading it. And this is where the UI and discussions come up, and external tooling, which might need to look at these kind of properties or parameters, but doesn't actually want to read a table. And I feel like it's the most open-ended thing to say, like, well, do you want some of the metadata.json? We have ways of defining parts of JSON already, so why don't we just have that as like a bulk API?
Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I mean, OpenAPI does allow for returning one of many different response types. So you can say, like, if you pass in this parameter, this request parameter, or this header parameter, that we're going to return to you this schema. And in that schema, several fields could be optional, whereas like in the default case, we're going to return back a different schema where all of the fields are required. So that is definable in the spec.
It's what I mean, Michael, with header param. Return a different schema depending on the param.
Yes. Right. But the response to that was, but hey, in the table metadata in the spec, all of these fields are required. You can have a different schema where the fields are no longer required, but now some of them are optional.
But you still need to redefine. You're basically defining an entire table metadata where things are optional, and an entire table metadata that is following the spec in terms of what's actually required to represent table metadata. So you have to define it twice.
I think so we have to define. Yeah. So this is actually one of the options. If we allow parameterize the response, then we have to define the actual one because we want to enable extra use cases. I think the first thing we're trying to establish here is these kind of a bunch of use cases are actual valid use case. There's a lot of the people asking for that engine side, UI side, asking for the slicing of the information instead of a whole thing. If we were decide to allow this use case, then extra like load table response have to be defined anyway, right? No matter it's in the new API or the existing APIs.
I propose that we explore the option to add a different schema on the existing endpoint, depending on the param, to see if it could be an option or not, as Michael proposed, and update the proposal with that, and have a new round of discussion on this, if it makes sense for everyone.
Makes sense to me. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sounds like we have the next step. Do we want to move to the next topic? Anyone want to have any final comments? Okay, so the next one is auth2 authentication guide. I think there are some new discussions on the dev list, and there's a new doc and a PR out, and we want to discuss that a bit more here. Christian, do you want to talk about the updates?
Yeah, sure. So after, well, the last time we discussed it here, and also some talks that I had in between, basically I rewrote some sections of the document. I hope I addressed most of the issues that the old one had. The old one was rather meant as a discussion document in this round. The new document is more supposed to be a guide for clients actually implementing auth. So yeah, any feedback basically is welcome. I would, after we are clear basically in this round and also in the Google Docs, I would move forward to actually migrate it to a markdown that we could add into the documentation. Yeah, maybe that's summing it up. I can also give a little bit more information if needed. I'm not really sure on where people are right now with this. So maybe to sum up, the original motivation of the guide was that we are currently missing a number of authentication flows basically in all of our clients. So client credential flow, for example, is not suitable for humans, for people. And most of our clients currently only implement client credential flow. So the idea was that by adding this guide, we kind of find a consensus between all of our different client implementations of which flows to implement and when to use those individual flows. So this is what this guide basically should provide. Yeah, just as a guide for use what.
Kristen, just one thing. Maybe what people is wondering is that as I read your document, it's kind of a description of the desired state, right? Of where we want to go, where we want to be, but it's not necessarily where we are today. We don't have those flows, right? So I think maybe what we need to start thinking about is what are the gaps between your documentation and the current state of OAuth in Iceberg REST, and start working towards that desired state.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a very good point. I think actually, like in Java, and we can also take a minute to discuss that. I think, I mean, your PR is going in the direction to providing the interface with the auth manager to implement those additional flows, but we will also need similar things in like all the other clients maintained by the Iceberg project, but the guide is supposed to do also a little bit more and be a guide for, you know, other tools out there connecting to Iceberg REST who might not use any of our packages under the hood. For example, single page applications, which are, you know, a web browser, for example, a UI that interfaces with the Iceberg REST interface to list tables that are available, also needs to interface. And we don't have a TypeScript library yet. However, this library still needs to implement those flows. Yeah, but yeah, so yeah, I think we need two things. First of all, we need a little bit of feedback on the document itself. If like every or not, or if something is missing. I also added the server-side token exchange, which will some catalog implementations still use. After talking to some folks, it's called legacy in there because I think it's kind of against everything that OAuth stands for, but I'm also fine with not calling it legacy if people still want to stick to it. Yeah, and then after we got more feedback in there, we also need to discuss how we get each of our client implementations to actually implement those flows. Yeah. So, I mean, it appears no one really has an opinion on that right now. We could also just postpone it to the next meeting and maybe give folks a chance to reread the document.
Yeah, I think that as Alex proposed, there are already some effort ongoing about that. So I think that it makes sense to take a deeper look on your doc, Christian, and clearly identify the gaps to have some kind of concrete proposal in terms of what we should do in the respec. So I propose that at least Alex and you work on the document in terms of identify the gaps, give us the time to review, and then we can chat during the next sync up.
Sounds good.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, I guess that also kind of transitions to the next one, which is the OS Manager PR. Alex, do you want to discuss that?
Yep, just turning my camera on for a while. Yeah. So what happened since the last sync? I got a good review from Daniel, who raised a good point about the usage of headers in the first state of my PR. So that was really, really helpful. I fixed I addressed all the remarks since then. And so I would really like to have another round of review if possible on that pull request. And since 1.7 is probably already closed at this point, I would really like to include that one in 1.8 if possible. That would be a good plan for us. Christian just mentioned the other languages. One thing I can offer as well is to reach out to some of the other languages we have. I'm not a good programmer in Python or Rust, but I do have some knowledge in Go, so I can reach out to those folks and start thinking about how this pull request would be translated into other languages, because I think the idea, right, is to have the same API across languages. So I think it's a good conversation to start, and that's I think a good time to start it. But yeah, that's it. So I think we are actually just waiting for some more brave eyes on that pull request. I know it's a cross-cutting concern, and security is not something that people feel comfortable reviewing. But if anyone feels adventurous enough, that would be really helpful.
Hey, I just want to add, I think in terms of where the Java PR is right now, we just need to take a little moment to validate that we're not breaking the existing behavior, because that's the only thing that I haven't really checked. And then looking into the other languages, one thing that I think would be really helpful is not trying to go and rewrite all of the various flows, especially for the OAuth implementations by hand, and looking for libraries that implement this. Like as you mentioned, the security stuff is pretty sensitive, and we don't want to screw it up. And we kind of handcrafted everything with Java, and I'd like to see if there is a possibility in the future to move over to something more standardized. But we should start there with the other languages, if possible.
So Polaris is already using Auth0 for some of the OAuth flows. I think that's a good option. It's, however, a trade-off between more libraries, more dependencies that go into Iceberg core versus implementing everything by hand. But yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, there are a number of options out there. So I think, if somebody is interested in exploring like what possibilities there are, Google has some good ones. There's OAuth, there's a couple others that I've run into. It's just, with the security stuff, that's where I would rather lean on a standardized library than, expect that we're going to do it better than the people who are looking at the security thing very closely.
Just want to add at one point. So one of the initial purpose of have that REST API, actually, we try to make client-side implementation as simple as possible. So we don't want to add a lot of burden for any new use case, new language. In case of they want to have the REST client implementation, we don't want to complement them furthermore. Yeah, I think Stan, you have the good points. Like if we want to set a party library for this particular requirement, that would be awesome. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I think that's reaching the end of the discussions. So I was taking some notes. I didn't finish yet. But any other topic that we would like to discuss?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we want to explore one of the options, which is remove the metadata.json file. I think it's a big topic. There's some discussion around, for example, because we are doing the REST catalog stuff. So theoretically, we don't have to have a physical file on the storage system for metadata.json. I know it's a very kind of disruptive change because right now a lot of the engine directly read that file, like Spark, or I think a lot of engine doing that. I'm not even sure if it's the right thing we want to do right now. But it did bring like a lot of the benefits, like we don't have to expose this as a file. Any?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in that, I think. And there's some real trade-offs that we have to make as a community, because like one of the things about having the JSON file is like it really allows for a lot of interoperability, just because there are lots of clients out there that know how to read the JSON file that don't necessarily know how to communicate with REST just yet. So dropping it as a requirement could be difficult. But I think there's also a lot of interest in dropping it as a requirement because of the things we can do through REST based on that. So I'm just pointing out that this is probably not the right forum to bring that question up. We should probably go to the general sync because it's actually a spec issue for the table format currently. That's the requirement. And I think that's probably the thing that we have to determine is just like as a spec, do we require it or do we just like relax that a little bit so it's required that it has to be produced or be available on request or something like that?
Yeah, I think I agree that I don't want to drop the requirement to produce a file. But I do want to remove from the standard implementation any place in which we don't use the REST load table API when possible, because we have a ton of that baked in right now where we go back to the file system over and over, and we really just shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I would add that from my point of view, the way I see it is that we need to strike a better balance between the specification of how files are written, about the actual file format, and the catalog specification, right? Because in the end, it's about information. If catalog provides a piece of information, does the client actually need to worry about whether that information resides in a file, right? So I think that's perfectly fine if access is if engine is connected to a catalog and catalog takes ownership of a particular piece of information, then the requirement to have that in a file is basically a catalog's responsibility. So this becomes more of a question of interoperability with file-based representation. So we can start talking about things like, now Iceberg has a canonical representation which is files-based, and if a catalog owns or wants to own that data and store it in a different medium, then there must be a way for the catalog to be asked, now export everything to files, because I want to move my data somewhere else, right? What do you think about that kind of approach?
That's a good one, Dimitri, but it assumes that the query engine use the catalog as source of truth for the metadata JSON. And today, not all query engines are doing that. I mean, some query engines directly access the metadata.json from the file system. And that's what Daniel said. I mean, the first step will be to force, or to enforce that all query engines use the catalog as source of truth for the metadata. And that's a big change. So
no, that's a valid point. What I mean is that this might be the way to approach it might be to have it as an extra kind of as an extra point, like maybe a configuration thing for the catalog. So if somebody knows the engine needs that information, that needs the file, then the catalog, when the catalog is connected to the engine, the catalog is asked to actually materialize the information as files. For
I got your point, but to be honest, I think that I think it will make more sense to be very opinionated, like it's the way it works, period. Because if we start to add a lot of options, like this endpoint or by configuration, you can access like this or like this, it's going to be a mess at the end of the day to deal with all the different use cases depending of query engines. So I think that, and it's what the REST spec is today, we should be very opinionated in the way it should work, and maybe more opinionated in the future.
Yeah, I agree with the opinionated case. I was what I was proposing was more about like how we can formalize it as a spec, and at the same time promote the new use cases. Yeah, I actually agree that it would be good if we could push engines to adopt the interactions through the catalog and not rely on files as much.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, I think we have a kind of consensus that it's the way to go. But we know that it's. I mean, just saying that is not enough. It's going to be a huge changes and adoption to drive. I know, for instance, in Apache Xtable, they don't consider at all the catalog, stuff like that. So for them, it will be a huge change to leverage a catalog. I mean, requiring a catalog. I mean, yeah, I don't say that it's not possible. I just said that it's going to take some time and adoption. Yeah, go ahead, Ashwin.
Yeah, in fact, you stole my words on Xtable, and not only on Xtable. in Microsoft, we are integrating, or supporting a lot of interoperability, and the file system brings immense power as well. So the simplicity, the interoperability which comes with file system, and replacing that and introducing a catalog to do all these kind of operations impacts the adoption. And in fact, not all cases require a lot of coordination, concurrency, and all. Like you see the published pattern which Big Lake adopts, Fabric adopts, even Snowflake adopts, that metadata is published later on. There's a lot of control, and file system brings a lot of interoperability and adoption experience. In fact, I was talking to Russ about it. We also think that even in the version hint file, which was deprecated with Hadoop catalog, if that is introduced back, the file system, when it comes to the representation of table, is complete. The data is there, the metadata is there, and once the user has authorization to read the file system, the table can completely be loaded. That is a very powerful pattern, and it has at least helped us a lot, and a lot of customers find it very valuable. So in fact, what I will do is I'll send a proposal also for publishing the version hint offline, as though it's using exporting the version file. But I'm a strong supporter of file system, and dropping that and forcing any other alternate path would be a blocker for us.
So Ashwin, if I may ask you a question, how do you envision interoperability in terms of multiple engines making concurrent changes to the same table if it's file-based?
Right. So see, you can think of all these beautiful cases where multiple engines are making changes to the same table. In practice, usually there is ownership with an engine, especially in a given window of time. So we don't lock the tables and ourselves, but there's a business unit which will most likely in practice adopt one engine to write their tables, and then these tables are read by all other engines. So for reporting purpose, for audit purpose, for security purpose, whatever. So there are more readers, but in practice, there's only one writer. So if you take the majority of cases, at least what we see, that the write ownership belongs to one engine, and there are many readers for a table, and like any kind of auth mechanism is, at least in case of Fabric, is the governance is enforced by the one lake storage layer. This is also in other cloud providers also, so not a surprise there.
Yeah, thanks.
I think so. As Russell said, we may probably never drop the file, and it is very useful actually. Consider the multiple engines still rely on that, and the conversion between format and how to make the interoperability between the engines and the different systems is also a very strong use case across multiple companies. There, I'm also bringing to but if we take a close look at the engine side, like Spark's future, it actually sometimes will load the file directly, which is unnecessary for certain for use cases. Maybe the only reasonable movement here is we try to push engine side to adopt more and more kind of API based instead of the file based metadata loading.
I totally agree with you. It's an optimization, but sorry, Dan, let's speak complete dissent. You can take it. It's an optimization, and I agree with it. In fact, a lot of this caching of metadata and using the APIs would be helpful, but replacing that would be, I think, a big blocker. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say, so this is kind of where we've been for a while, like going back and forth between like the advantages of dropping the requirement for catalog-based use cases versus the advantages of interoperability for having the JSON representation in the file system. And so I don't think we're at a point where it's clear that it's a good time to drop it, but there are lots of advantages for not having to produce that, or in the future, especially with more catalog-based, managed warehousing solutions, you may not have access to that JSON in the same way. It may be less important in time. And so we've just kind of been letting this play out. It isn't a huge burden at this point to actually produce the metadata JSON file. And I think if we follow through with many of the discussions we've had about like cleaning up elements of the metadata JSON so that it doesn't cause the size issues and other problems that are causing concerns in some areas, it may alleviate a lot of the pain around metadata that we're seeing, and it just becomes this lightweight operation that we continue to do. So I'm open to arguments on both sides. I think that they're equally convincing, which is why I don't think there's been a strong push in one direction or the other. But we have reasons why we'd like to drop the JSON. We have reasons we want to keep it. So.
Yeah, and for me, it's not an issue. I mean, to maintain both access, that's okay. It's the discussion with Dimitri was exactly this. I don't think that it makes sense to say, okay, the catalog going to be the unique source of truth for the metadata. Doesn't make sense to me. I mean, at least right now. So we want to have a better experience with REST catalog, generally speaking, like a caching, like a lot of things. But for you especially, that's okay to still have access directly to the metadata.json. That's okay to me. I mean, one is not the opposite of the other. I mean, we can maintain both, at least for now. I don't see an issue.
I think the question is just like, do we still require it to be there? So as of right now, the spec requires the metadata JSON file to be there. You could lift that requirement and say, hey, well, you can produce it for interoperability use cases, but it just means that if there's a shift towards not producing it, it limits that interoperability for all the engines that currently still point to a metadata location. And there are a fair number of them right now. So
that's a good point then. I think that making it optional, but with the case that some query engine may need it or not, but that will depend on the query engine. I mean, in your case, Ashvin, I can see that your query engine gonna still use the metadata.json, so it could be populated, but some other query engine can just ignore it, and that's okay. So potentially we may have some differences in terms of how the query engines are looking for the metadata, but that's not a big deal in my opinion. I mean, we already have some differences between query engines, so that's one more.
Okay, anything else we'd like to discuss?
Yeah, if we have time, I'd like to gather some thoughts on the recent proposal I put out for the fine-grained metadata commits. I don't know if everyone here has taken a look, but yeah, ultimately, I'm in a place where if you have, if you guys can share your thoughts, but I know Ryan has left quite a bit of comments on it. But I'd like to kind of stress or reiterate that basically I'm trying to figure out the best way to move snapshot production to the catalog, and what information does the catalog need to know to perform those operations. And I know that there's some validations that I'd rather the server have, so that the server can be in charge of any conflict resolution protocol that they want to enforce. And the doc, I think, has a little bit of confusion because some people believe that the client should be sending or doing this validation beforehand. But in order to send the catalog the validations they need to perform, I did look into every single code path for every engine to see what validations are actually performing, what are they doing. and how could I group them up in the least efficient way, or in the most efficient way. So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that if you guys have anything.
I'm not sure how many people have actually looked at it yet. I know that I've looked at it. I need to go look at the latest version of it. And I think so now we still are at a point where we have the request and response objects already defined, or no, we don't have anything defined for this one, right? That's the PR for the request and response objects is for the pre-planned scan, right?
Yeah, they're not defined right now.
Okay.
Basically, the model in the doc is in a place where it's separated between the optimized files and the produce snapshot update. But I know there's a comment there to unify those. So, but they encapsulate what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, so now I'm remembering what the last was, and I feel like the feedback was more that, you know, we broke it into a couple different representations for like how we do updates, but in some ways, like the way that we do an update to a table right now encapsulates all the changes. Why? Well, because that's how we do an update to the table right now. So if you have an append operation or a replace operation, you're defining which portions of the table you're adding or replacing. So for an append, you have added files. So having a single request that kind of reflects that same model. And I think the feedback was largely that like, hey, it was broken up into these two separate kind of operations that didn't entirely make sense as distinctly separate operations. Modeling it more like how we actually represent a snapshot, and then, you know, defining the requests and what needs to be validated based on what type of operation you're doing. So I don't know if it's been updated since that revision. That was kind of my takeaway reading through and looking at like just what was actually included in how we performed the fine grain commit.
Yeah, that I think you're saying, because before I structured the model to encapsulate both the delete files, the added delete files, and the added data files, and the same thing for the removes, right?
Well, so let's see here. Do you have the doc in the?
Yeah.
It would be helpful if we could get that into the community sync notes, just so everybody can link off to it.
It's number 4 in your discussion. Yeah.
And so you said it was just December 4th? What?
No, number 4 on the Iceberg catalog scene. On the discussion.
How come I'm not seeing that? Okay. Is it number 5? Okay, here.
Oh, I added it to the wrong spot. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so like for example, like we have these two, like produce overwrite rows snapshot update. We have produce optimize files snapshot update. But optimize files is actually just a rewrite operation, right?
Yeah.
So what I think the way that I'm looking at it is, if we're pushing the commit operation towards the catalog, representing it in the way that we represent the changes to the snapshot, which is largely having a single one, which is just, hey, this is a snapshot update. And then having it have all of the different fields for added, removed, like what's defined here. But then what gets validated is based on the operation and, what change is actually being indicated that needs to happen. So if you said like, hey, I'm just appending files or just adding data, but I'm actually removing rows, how do we represent that? And what does that actually mean? Should that be allowed? Right now, we enforce that through the APIs on what you can perform in any given operation and update. But we need to somehow take that and represent this in a way that the catalog can validate the intent that is expressed by the client, right?
Yeah.
So I think like the one that kind of confused me a little bit is like the optimized files snapshot update. That is actually a behavior of what is an actual just like commit. Like, yeah, you're modifying files, but it's a replace optimize or a replace operation. And I should see files, removed, files added. I would expect that I would need to validate things like, hey, the expected number of rows or stats or things like that corresponds to the operation that you're actually performing. So I think that there's still probably a little bit of massaging that we need to do. I think you have a lot of the fields, but the construct in which we're looking at this, it doesn't quite align with the way that I would think about, a catalog side commit request. Does that make sense? I think that reflects a little bit of what Ryan's comments were as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think the optimized file is going to be an interesting one because when you remove files, you have to keep track of a sequence number that ultimately might not be in the delete file, right? So that model's unifying that is going to be a little weird.
Just one minor point, because this I think this is very useful in case of when you do the compaction. If you want to just do like partial compaction of the whole table, especially for big table, you kind of you just send back the graduate like five files and 10 files graduate into that table to the commit, which it much faster in the commit phase when it might conflicts with the other ingestion pipelines. This one minor thing is it will generate a lot of the commits, right? Is there any implication from your side to see, okay, this might impact some performance or any other components of the ecosystem?
I would actually just comment that like it doesn't change anything. Like you have the exact same problem if you're committing from a client really fast or something like that. I think this isn't to address the case of like fast commits, if that's what your question was, like, right? I mean, we're pushing where the commit is happening, but it doesn't change any of the other aspects of what happens when a commit happens. So
yeah. I agree with that. But the I think it's it will be much faster. Like it's generally more like I'm asking more general question. What if we have so many commits during the short time? Yeah. I know they both generate the same question.
So that's a very like good thing to call out. It is actually part of the discussion that led to this particular proposal because we separated like the question of, hey, asynchronous appends where we can handle fast appends, and then the catalog is like combining those into larger commits so that you don't have this problem of lots of incremental, really tiny commits causing problems with the metadata or anything else. And we actually specifically separated that problem from this problem. And this problem is just like, hey, for clients that need less complexity around how they perform the commit operation, especially if there are simple clients and they just want to append files to the table, they can use this API without having all the complexity of state management and everything else within the Iceberg client libraries. This also allows us to, handle, the, cross-version table compatibility and various other things from clients that may not be able to operate with other tables. Like the catalog can handle a lot of those challenges. So this is more squarely in the like pushing logic to catalog, not solving the fast append problem. Could somebody abuse this API? Absolutely. Like if you just, issue a bunch of append requests, you get the same behavior as if you just used a client to perform a bunch of like individual row appends or something like that. But it's not like the intent is not to address the case of like, hey, how do we handle fast append? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you have any proposal or discussion somewhere to kind of manifest which went to two-phase first to prepare manifold file, then commit it the one time? So I think the Kafka connector somehow did that.
Well, so the Kafka Connect actually doesn't do that. It uses a like writers and a command and control queue. So there's only one consumer on that queue that gathers up the files and commits to the catalog. So we took care of the problem of like the distributed commit issue with Kafka by centralizing where the commit happens. This, like, you could effectively say like, hey, with a catalog implementation like this, you could have each worker commit to the catalog, but then you have the same problem as if each worker on the actual Kafka commit were using the client library and committing to the catalog. It has exactly the same problem. So this isn't solving the fast append or multiple append from clients. It's purely pushing the logic back to the catalog. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I...
Yeah. I think I'm more asking what's the major implication we see if we have a fast committee issues. I'm not talking about this is trying to solve that issues, right? What do we like other than like increase the metadata JSON file a lot, which is potentially a performance issue in case you want to loading them, right? Because there's so many snapshots within the metadata.
So I think the answer to that is probably just, you need to do more aggressive metadata cleanup. And that's something that the catalog can actually do. Your catalog can say, hey, I'm only going to keep X number of snapshots. And then as the commits are coming in, it's removing the metadata that, it's saying like, so if you have a really fast appending table, you don't actually want a lot of snapshots involved. So then the catalog could do aggressive cleanup against that, keep the metadata small by performing more aggressive maintenance. There's always going to be that conflict though. Like you can't have infinite like time travel with lots of commits and not have a lot of metadata. Like all of those things are related.
I think we still have to keep all these commits because retention is kind of another dimension of how do you keep the data or snapshots, right? But still at the same time, we want to combine like compaction of the metadata so that it still make the reader more performed.
Yeah, and there are approaches that this isn't something that I necessarily think we need to build into Iceberg, but you could tag specific versions. So you could tag, like if you have a really fast moving table, you could tag hourly and remove all the incremental changes between hours. Or, you could store that metadata in some other place that is more aligned with it and then use refs or something for clients. But we still are in the same problem of like lots of commits produces lots of metadata, which, means lots of processing in order to handle that. That's currently still a persistent problem. I think we're a little over time, Jack.
Yeah, I guess we can wrap up the conversation here, and for the remaining topics, we can discuss on the dev list and in the docs.
I have one thing. Can we stay for just a second? So we just got PRs for 1.7 removed from the Open API spec, the load view credential response. Let's go over that real fast because we want this in 1.7. We should know what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay. So Edward is not here. I think he's the one that posted that, right?
Yes, we have two PRs, one for the spec now and one for the core.
Yeah, so we're a little concerned about introducing that because there have been some discussions in terms of like, how do we implement secure views? And that sending back a vended credential for the view would potentially take us down a path in the implementation that conflicts with what we might want to do for secure views. So they're working on a write-up that is a collaboration with Ryan and some other people on I think AWS on how do we do secure views, how do we represent them, how do you scope access. And right now that vended credential for the view isn't required for view definition. Right? You don't actually need that in order to load the view. It comes back through the metadata, and committing should go through the catalog API as well. So the credential was put in there without a specific purpose for it. And our concern is that if people go to implement and think that they can implement views by passing back a vended credential through that path, it creates two different paths, one for secure views and one for this. So we can always add this back if we find that there's a good use case, but we don't want to introduce something that causes friction with secure views, since that's the proposal.
Quick question here. So this was added only 2 weeks ago, right? So we don't actually have this in any release.
Right.
So
we can fix it now and not cause a deprecation issue. Yeah.
I just want to make sure we get everyone who was reviewing on that. So that's just Amog, right?
Yeah, Amog, is he here? No, it looks like he's off. So I can ping them and we can get that in today if people are comfortable with committing it. But
I have no problem with removing it. I just want to make sure if it hasn't been in any release before, I just want to make sure everyone who put it in the first place is okay with pulling it out right now. And if that's just Amog right now, then that's fine.
Yeah, sorry, that was last minute rush because we realized that we probably didn't want to include it. And we didn't want to go through deprecations.
Okay, got a thumbs up from Jack. Anyone else have any strong feelings on this?
Just to be clear for everyone, on the pull request on core, the load view response where credential are removed, it was not there before in any release. So as Daniel said, yeah, I mean, it's important for everyone. There are no breaking changes. It's actually more cleanup and be in the same state as we were in 1.6, for instance. So just for everyone on the call to understand what we are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I assume if it's only been in the code base for 2 weeks, we have a very limited number of people who even know this is there. I just want to make sure if any of those people are in this room, they can say something now before we get rid of it.
No, I agree with the cleanup for me. So I'm going to review and vote on the pull request anyway.
Okay, sounds good. That's my only thing. Thanks for staying late, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You guys.